The courtroom hummed with quiet anticipation. Spectators whispered in hushed tones, lawyers shuffled their papers, and the distant sound of a judge's gavel echoed from another chamber. At the bench sat Judge Eleanor Hayes, her posture upright, her gaze steady, exuding the authority that years on the bench had instilled in her. To her, this was just another day, another case among countless others. The bailiff stepped forward, his voice cutting through the murmurs in the room. The state of Louisiana versus James Anderson. Eleanor reached for the case file in front of her, flipping through the neatly typed pages. Assault, robbery, resisting arrest. A familiar pang of disappointment settled in her chest. Another lost soul tangled in the system. She had seen it too many times before, men and women standing before her, their lives defined by the few mistakes they had made or by circumstances beyond their control. She let out a quiet breath, preparing herself to hear the evidence, to uphold the law, to ensure justice was served. And then he walked in. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and the defendant was led inside, wrists and ankles shackled. The air seemed to shift, an unseen weight pressing against Eleanor's chest as her eyes fell upon him. Her fingers instinctively tightened around her gavel. The man standing before her was not a stranger. He was James Anderson. Her James. For the first time in her career, Judge Eleanor Hayes hesitated. As the bailiff led the defendant into the courtroom, Judge Eleanor Hayes felt her breath catch in her throat. No, this can't be. The man standing before her, shackled at the wrists and ankles, wasn't just another name in a case file. He was James Anderson, her childhood friend. For a moment, the courtroom faded, the murmur of the spectators, the rustling of papers, even the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. Everything blurred into a distant hum as the weight of recognition settled in her chest. James. Memory surged forward, unbidden and unstoppable. She saw two children racing their bicycles down the dusty roads of Hammond, Louisiana, laughter spilling into the warm summer air. She saw them lying side by side beneath the sprawling branches of a magnolia tree, whispering about their futures, sharing dreams too big for the small town that sought to contain them. Eleanor, James had once said, his voice barely more than a breath against the quiet night, do you ever think about leaving this place? Like, really leaving? Going somewhere people don't look at us funny just for sitting together? She had laughed then, brushing off the thought as childish fancy. But James hadn't been joking. Even as a boy, he had seen the world for what it was, a place that didn't always make room for people like him. Their friendship had been a silent rebellion, an unspoken defiance against the invisible walls that divided their town. But the walls had been stronger than them. She remembered the day everything changed. It was the summer before high school. They had been sitting on her front porch, the golden light of evening stretching long shadows across the wooden steps. Then her father's voice. Cold, sharp, unforgiving. Eleanor. Inside. Now. She had hesitated, her heart pounding, looking at James. He was frozen, his expression unreadable. Go on, he had said softly, the resignation in his voice cutting deeper than any shouted words. I'll see you around. But they hadn't seen each other again. Her father had forbidden her from going near James. Soon after, his family had packed up and left town. And Eleanor? She had buried herself in school, in ambition, in the relentless pursuit of success, chasing justice, fairness, the very things that had once been denied to her best friend. And now here he was, not a boy with wild dreams anymore, but a man shaped by hardship. His shoulders were hunched, his face lined with years of struggle. But his eyes, his deep, soulful eyes, hadn't changed. They still held that quiet strength, that flicker of something untamed. For the first time in her career, Eleanor hesitated. What was she supposed to do now? The air in the courtroom was tense, charged with unspoken weight. This was not just another case. The prosecutor, Richard Powell, a sharp-faced man with a practiced air of confidence, rose from his seat and addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is simple. The defendant, James Anderson, entered a convenience store late at night, assaulted the clerk, and stole money from the register. He was apprehended just a few blocks from the crime scene, still in possession of the stolen cash. The evidence will show that he is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. His words were cold, clinical. To him, James was just another name on a docket, another case to win. Eleanor shifted slightly in her seat, her fingers pressing against the polished wood of the bench. Then, the prosecutor presented his key evidence. A grainy surveillance video from the store, poorly lit, the image distorted. A man in a red hoodie lunging at the counter. A witness, the store clerk, who had seen a man matching James's general description. But something felt off. The video was too blurry to make out a face. The witness hesitated, uncertain when asked to confirm the attacker's identity. Then, it was time for the defense. Lisa Porter, James's attorney, stood up. Young but sharp, her voice carried across the room with quiet authority. "The prosecution would have you believe this case is straightforward," she began, pacing slightly before the jury. "But I urge you to look deeper." She turned toward the surveillance footage still frozen on the screen. "This video, can anyone in this room say with certainty that this is James Anderson?" The jury members exchanged uncertain glances. Lisa continued, her tone unwavering. "Mr. Anderson was not caught at the crime scene. There was no physical evidence linking him to the robbery. No fingerprints. No weapon. No stolen money found directly on him. Just cash, which, last time I checked, is not a crime to carry." She let the words hang in the air. Then, she dropped her final point. "And James has an alibi." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Lisa turned back to face the jury. "On the night of the robbery, my client was walking home from a friend's house. That friend can confirm his whereabouts." The prosecutor scoffed. "Then why is this so-called friend not here to testify?" Lisa's jaw tightened. "Because he's afraid." She let that word sink in. Afraid of retaliation. Afraid that just standing up for a man like James will put a target on his back. Eleanor's grip on the gavel tightened. The weight of reality pressed against her. Then came the turning point. Lisa called Officer Daniel Harris to the stand, the officer who arrested James. A burly man with a stern expression, he sat stiffly as she approached. "Officer Harris," Lisa said, her tone polite but firm. "You were the one who detained my client, correct?" "That's right," Harris replied, his voice clipped. "Where exactly did you arrest him?" "2 blocks from the convenience store." Lisa nodded. "And what made you believe he was the suspect?" Harris shifted slightly. "He matched the description, a black male, mid-40s, wearing dark clothing." Lisa's eyebrows raised. Dark clothing. She turned back toward the surveillance footage, gesturing at the screen. "The suspect in this video was described as wearing a red hoodie. Did you find a red hoodie on Mr. Anderson?" A pause. A hesitation. "No." Lisa took a step closer. "Did you or any other officer search the surrounding area for this missing hoodie?" Harris's jaw tightened. "We didn't have time." Lisa let out a small, knowing breath. "So, to clarify, James Anderson was arrested not because of direct evidence, not because anyone actually saw his face, but because he fit the description." Silence. The jury exchanged uneasy looks. Lisa didn't let up. "Did Mr. Anderson say anything when you arrested him?" Harris hesitated. He protested. He said he was innocent. Lisa took another step forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "And did you investigate his claim? Or did you assume guilt based solely on his appearance?" Harris's face reddened. "I followed protocol." Lisa let his words hang in the air before turning to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you, was this an arrest based on evidence? Or was it based on assumption?" The courtroom was dead silent. Eleanor's heartbeat pounded in her ears. This case, it wasn't just about James. It was about a system that decided who was guilty before they even had a chance to prove otherwise. And she was the one who had to make sure justice was served. The courtroom was still. All eyes were on James Anderson as he slowly rose from his seat, the faint clink of his shackles breaking the silence. Lisa Porter, his attorney, had warned him of the risks, told him that testifying could be dangerous, that anything he said could be twisted against him. But James insisted. He had spent his entire life being spoken about, being accused, being judged. Now, for the first time, he would speak for himself. He stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate, as if carrying the weight of something far heavier than the chains on his wrists. He took a breath, then another, and then he spoke. "I have made mistakes." His voice, rough yet steady, filled the courtroom. "I have done things in my life that I am not proud of. I have taken wrong turns, trusted the wrong people. But I did not do this." A murmur swept through the spectators, but James didn't flinch. He turned his gaze to the jury, 12 strangers who held his future in their hands. "You don't know me," he continued. "You only know what you've been told. A black man with a record, arrested near a crime scene. Maybe, for some of you, that's enough." The room was silent. Even the prosecutor, so full of confidence before, sat motionless. James exhaled, his shoulders rising and falling. But let me tell you what it's like to live every day knowing that people have already made up their minds about you. To walk into a store and feel the clerk watching your hands instead of your face. To be stopped by police, not because you did something wrong, but because you fit the description. His voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. I've been fighting my whole life. Fighting to be seen as more than just a statistic, more than a suspect, more than a case file in front of a judge. Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest. She had spent years believing in justice, believing in the system. But sitting here, watching James, her childhood friend, stand before her, pleading for fairness that should have already been his, she wasn't so sure anymore. James clenched his fists at his sides. I am tired. His words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. I am tired of having to prove that I am worthy of fairness, that I am worthy of justice, that I am worthy of being heard. He took a slow, steady breath. I just want the truth to matter. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Eleanor swallowed hard, her grip tightening around her gavel. She had always believed that the law was impartial, that it stood above bias and prejudice. But now, watching James stand there, fighting for his life not just against the accusations, but against the assumptions, she wondered, was the system truly fair? Or had it already decided who James Anderson was long before he ever walked into this courtroom? The jury had left the courtroom. The air was thick with tension, so heavy it felt almost suffocating. Some people whispered in hushed voices, their murmurs barely audible. Others sat still, their eyes locked on the empty jury box. James Anderson sat motionless. His hands were clasped together, fingers intertwined so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. His expression was unreadable, but Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders, in the way he held himself, as if bracing for a storm. The minutes stretched into hours. Eleanor tried to focus on the case files before her, but her mind wandered. Would they see the truth? Would they look past the assumptions, the biases, the weight of history that had been stacked against James before he even walked into this courtroom? Or would they see only what they had been conditioned to see? A black man, a past record, a suspect. Then, the doors opened. The jury had reached a verdict. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman in a navy blazer, stepped forward, holding a small slip of paper in her trembling hands. The courtroom fell silent. Eleanor gripped her gavel, her heart pounding in a way it never had before. The foreperson cleared her throat and began to read. In the case of the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson, we find the defendant. She paused, a pause that stretched too long, that made the air itself feel too thick, too heavy. Not guilty. For a moment, the room stood still. Then chaos. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. A few people murmured in relief, while others shook their heads in disapproval. The prosecution stiffened. The lead detective muttered something under his breath. James exhaled, not in celebration, not in joy, but in relief. His shoulders sagged slightly, as if a massive weight had just been lifted from him. But he didn't smile. He didn't look triumphant, because he knew. He knew this wasn't a victory. This wasn't proof that the system had worked. This was luck, a rare moment when the dice had landed in his favor, when the system that had been designed to break men like him had, for once, decided to let him go. But what about the next man? The next trial? How many more would not be as lucky? Eleanor tapped her gavel, restoring order to the room. Her voice was steady, but her heart was not. The jury has spoken. Mr. Anderson, you are free to go. Court is adjourned. She stood up, watching as James was unshackled, watching as he rubbed his wrists, the marks of the chains still fresh on his skin, watching as he stood, glancing around the room as if unsure of where to go next. The case was over. The system had spoken, but Eleanor's heart remained heavy. Had justice truly been served? Or had James simply been given permission to walk away, for now? The courtroom had emptied. The murmurs, the whispers, the tension that had filled the air moments ago had dissipated. The jury was gone. The reporters had packed up their notebooks. The lawyers were already moving on to their next cases. But James Anderson remained. He stood near the defense table, watching Eleanor. For a moment, she thought he might just walk away, that he would leave without a word, disappearing back into a world that had never been kind to him. But then, he moved toward her. Slow, deliberate steps. Eleanor didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe as he stopped in front of her bench. He studied her, really studied her. Then, In a quiet, steady voice, he asked, "You knew, didn't you?" Eleanor swallowed. James didn't need to explain. She knew exactly what he meant. "You knew it was me the second I walked into this courtroom." Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. But James didn't look angry, just tired. "Why didn't you say anything?" His voice wasn't accusing, just curious, searching. Eleanor's throat felt dry, her words coming out soft, almost fragile. "I couldn't." She took a slow breath. "I had to be fair. If I said something, it might have jeopardized the case." James let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. He nodded slightly, looking away for a brief moment, before his eyes met hers again. And then, he said something that hit her like a blow. "Fair." The word hung between them, cold and hollow. James shook his head, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. But there was no joy in it, only understanding. The kind that comes from a lifetime of knowing exactly where you stand in the world. "Fair," he repeated, softer this time. He let the word roll off his tongue, testing its weight. "You know, Eleanor, the world has never been fair for people like me." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness, just truth. A truth she had always known but had never spoken aloud. A truth that had kept them apart when they were children. A truth that had dictated the way he was seen, the way he was judged, the way he was almost condemned for a crime he didn't commit. She had spent her whole life believing in the law, believing in justice. But now, she wasn't so sure anymore. The silence between them stretched. Eleanor wanted to say something, anything, that she was sorry, that she should have done more. Not just now, back then, but the words never came. Because how could she possibly make it better? James watched her for a long moment. Then he nodded, not in forgiveness, not in anger, just acknowledgement. And then he turned and walked away. Eleanor watched as he pushed open the heavy courtroom doors, stepping out into the world beyond. She wanted to call after him, to tell him that she understood now, that she would do better, that she would fight harder. But James was already gone, and Eleanor was left alone in the empty courtroom, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a verdict she could never overturn. The courtroom was empty now. The once crowded benches stood silent. The echoes of voices that had filled the space just hours ago had faded into nothingness. And at the judge's bench, Eleanor Hayes sat alone. Her gavel lay untouched before her. The polished wood of the bench, once a symbol of authority, justice, power, now felt cold beneath her fingertips. She exhaled slowly, staring at the vacant seat where James Anderson had sat. The law had done its job today. The system had worked, this time. But was that enough? She had spent her career believing that justice was blind, that the law was an equal force, impartial and unwavering. But today, she had seen something else. She had seen how prejudice could lurk beneath procedure, how assumptions could outweigh evidence, how, for people like James, the fight wasn't just about proving innocence, it was about proving humanity. She had upheld the law today, but had she upheld justice? A quiet sigh escaped her lips. She wasn't sure anymore. For the first time in her career, Eleanor realized that her job wasn't just to hand down verdicts. It was to make sure the system she served was truly fair. To ensure that people like James weren't just lucky to escape injustice, but protected from it altogether. She couldn't change the past. She couldn't rewrite the years of silence and separation. She couldn't undo the world that had made James Anderson guilty before he ever set foot in her courtroom. But she could do something. She could fight. Fight for a justice system that didn't just follow the rules, but questioned them. Fight for a world where fairness wasn't a privilege, but a right. Eleanor rose from her seat, pushing back the heavy chair with a quiet scrape against the floor. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. She stood in the doorway, the last remnants of daylight painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. She took a breath, and then she made a vow. I can't change the past, but I can fight for a better future. With that, Eleanor Hayes stepped forward, not just as a judge, but as a woman determined to make a difference. And for the first time in a long time, she felt ready. If this story made you think, don't just scroll away, take action. Like this video to help spread awareness. Share it with your friends and family, because conversations spark change. Comment below and tell us your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power? Let's talk about it. Follow our channel for more powerful real-life stories. And turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Change starts with awareness. Awareness starts with you. Be part of the movement.